The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop outside the Fort Lyon trading post, and Willa Everett tumbled forward into the lap of a whiskey-breathed miner who hadn't bathed since leaving Kansas, her carpetbag spilling its contents across the floor in a cascade of embroidered handkerchiefs and carefully folded letters from her late mother. It was August 1876, and Colorado Territory blazed under an unforgiving sun that turned the dirt roads to dust and the air to something thick enough to chew. Willa gathered her belongings with shaking hands, stuffing everything back into the worn bag while the other passengers pushed past her toward the door. The miner offered no apology, just a gap-toothed leer that made her skin crawl. She'd been traveling for 3 weeks from Boston, and every mile had stripped away another layer of the confidence she'd carefully built during her years at Miss Halloway's school for young ladies. The driver called out something unintelligible from his perch, and Willa forced herself to stand on unsteady legs. She was 22 years old, orphaned 6 months prior, and every cent she had left in the world was sewn into the lining of her corset. Her Aunt Martha had written that Fort Lyon needed a schoolteacher, and Willa had packed her life into 2 bags and bought a ticket west without letting herself think too hard about what she was leaving behind. The trading post door stood propped open with a rusted horseshoe, and inside the dim interior, she could make out shelves stacked with everything from ammunition to bolts of calico. A man stood behind the counter, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and when she stepped through the doorway, he looked up with eyes the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic. "Help you, miss?" His voice was rough but not unkind, and Willa opened her mouth to respond. "I'm looking for Martha Thompson." The words came out in stuttering bursts, and she felt heat flood her cheeks. She's my aunt." The man's expression didn't change, didn't show the irritation or mockery she'd grown accustomed to seeing whenever her nerves got the better of her tongue. Instead, he simply nodded and set down the ledger he'd been writing in. "Martha's place is about 2 miles north of here, near the creek. Yellow house with a blue door, can't miss it." He paused, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. "You planning to walk it in this heat?" Willa swallowed hard, trying to force the words out smoothly. I don't have much choice." "Reckon you do." The man came around the counter, and she saw he was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands that looked capable of breaking a man in half or handling something delicate with equal ease. "I'm heading that direction to deliver some supplies to the Sullivan Ranch. Can drop you at Martha's on the way." She should have been wary. Every lesson her mother had ever taught her about propriety and safety screamed that a young woman didn't accept rides from strange men in frontier towns. But something about the way he stood there, patient and solid as a mountain, made her believe she could trust him. Thank you," she managed, and this time she caught the smallest quirk of his lips, something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Name's Nathan Worthing," he said, extending his hand. "Most folks call me Nate." Her hand disappeared into his, calloused palm warm against her skin. Willa Everett." "Pleasure, Miss Everett. Give me 5 minutes to load the wagon and we'll get you out of this heat." True to his word, Nathan had a wagon loaded and ready before she'd even finished a cup of water from the tin dipper at the post's water barrel. He helped her up onto the seat with the same careful courtesy he might have shown a duchess, then swung up beside her with an easy grace that suggested he'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. The wagon rolled north along a rutted road that followed the Arkansas River, and Willa tried not to be too aware of how close Nathan sat beside her, his arm occasionally brushing hers when the wheels hit a particularly deep groove. The landscape stretched out in all directions, vast and open in a way that made her feel simultaneously free and terrifyingly exposed. Back in Boston, buildings crowded together like gossiping matrons, and you were never more than a few feet from another human soul. Here, the emptiness seemed to go on forever. "You the new schoolteacher?" Nathan asked after a few minutes of companionable silence. Willa nodded, not trusting her voice. She'd learned years ago that the less she said, the less opportunity her stutter had to embarrass her. "That's good news for the town. Previous teacher left back in March to get married, and the kids have been running wild ever since." He glanced at her, and she caught the hint of amusement in his expression. "Fair warning, though. Billy Sullivan is 7 years old and twice as ornery as his daddy's prize bull. You'll have your hands full with that one." Despite her nervousness, Willa felt herself smile. Children had always been easier than adults. They didn't judge her stutter, didn't grow impatient when she struggled to get a sentence out. They just waited, curious and open in the way that only the young could be. I like a challenge," she said, and was rewarded with a genuine smile from Nathan that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "I bet you do, Miss Everett. Anyone who comes all the way from back east to teach in a place like Fort Lyon has to have some steel in them." They talked in fits and starts as the wagon rolled along, Nathan asking questions that didn't require long answers, and never once showing impatience when she stumbled over her words. She learned that he'd been in Colorado for 8 years, that he worked as a ranch hand and occasional deputy when Sheriff Morrison needed help, that he'd come west from Missouri after the war ended, and his family's farm had been burned to nothing but ashes and bitter memories. The yellow house came into view sooner than Willa expected, its blue door exactly as Nathan had described. Her Aunt Martha must have heard the wagon approaching because she appeared in the doorway before Nathan had even pulled the horses to a stop, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron and calling out a greeting that carried all the warmth of a woman who'd been waiting months to see her niece. "Willa." "Oh, my darling girl, you made it." Nathan helped Willa down from the wagon, his hands steady at her waist, and she felt an odd pang of disappointment when he released her. Martha swept her into an embrace that smelled of bread dough and lavender, chattering questions faster than Willa could have answered even if her tongue worked perfectly. "Thank you for bringing her, Nathan," Martha said, finally releasing Willa enough to beam at the cowboy. "Will you stay for supper? I've got a roast that's more than these 2 women can eat." "Thank you kindly, Mrs. Thompson, but I need to get these supplies to the Sullivans before dark." He tipped his hat to both of them, his eyes lingering on Willa for just a moment longer. "Welcome to Fort Lyon, Miss Everett. I'm sure I'll be seeing you around town." Willa watched the wagon roll away down the dusty road, something fluttering in her chest that had nothing to do with nervousness and everything to do with the memory of storm-colored eyes and patient kindness. Martha's house was small but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that took up half the main living space, and windows that let in the late afternoon light in golden streams. Over supper, her aunt explained that school would start in 2 weeks, giving Willa time to settle in and prepare the one-room schoolhouse that had been sitting empty all summer. "The town's smaller than what you're used to," Martha said, ladling stew into Willa's bowl. "Maybe 200 souls if you count the ranches in the surrounding area, but they're good people, mostly. Hard workers who don't have much but are willing to share what they've got." Willa ate and listened, letting Martha's comfortable chatter wash over her. Her aunt had moved west 15 years ago with her husband, a cavalry officer who'd been stationed at Fort Lyon during the Indian Wars. He died 5 years back from pneumonia, but Martha had stayed, making a life for herself as the town's seamstress and unofficial keeper of everyone's secrets and stories. "That Nathan Worthing who brought you," Martha said, her eyes twinkling with a matchmaker's gleam that Willa recognized immediately. "He's a good man. Quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but reliable as sunrise. Every unmarried woman in 50 miles has set her cap for him at one point or another, but he's never shown interest in any of them." "Aunt Martha," Willa protested, but her aunt just laughed. "I'm just saying, it's nice to have a handsome young man be the first person to welcome you to town. Better than crusty old Mr. Henderson at the trading post, anyway." That night, Willa lay in the small bedroom that would be hers, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Colorado frontier. Coyotes called in the distance, and the wind made the house creak in ways that were nothing like the settled groans of her Boston brownstone. She thought about Nathan's patient expression when she'd stuttered through her words, the way he'd simply waited without trying to finish her sentences or look away in discomfort. She'd spent her whole life being made to feel less than because of the way her words tangled on her tongue. Teachers had been exasperated, suitors had been embarrassed, and even her own mother, loving as she was, had sometimes grown frustrated when Willa couldn't get a sentence out. But Nathan had just waited, as if her words were worth however long it took for them to come. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. The schoolhouse needed cleaning, desks needed repairing, and Willa spent hours going over the curriculum she'd brought from Boston and adapting it for a frontier classroom that would have students ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Martha helped when she could, but she had her own sewing to attend to, so Willa often found herself alone in the dusty schoolhouse with nothing but her thoughts and the mice that skittered in the corners. She saw Nathan twice during those weeks. The first time was at the general store when she was buying supplies, and he'd helped her carry the heavy packages back to Martha's wagon while asking how her preparations were going. The second time was at Sunday service, where she sat with Martha in a pew near the back and tried not to notice how Nathan's shoulders filled out his Sunday coat, or the way his attention seemed to drift in her direction more than once during Reverend Michael's lengthy sermon about the prodigal son. After the service, as the congregation mingled outside under the cottonwood trees, Nathan approached them with his hat in his hands. "Miss Everett," he said, and she noticed how the other young women in the congregation watched with poorly concealed interest. "I wondered if you'd like to see some of the country around here before you get too busy with teaching. There's a canyon about an hour's ride north that's worth seeing if you're interested." Willa's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to say yes, wanted it more than she'd wanted anything in months, but the words stuck in her throat like always. "I'd like that," she finally managed, and saw Martha practically glowing with approval beside her. They arranged to meet the following Saturday afternoon, and Willa spent the intervening days in a state of nervous anticipation that made her stutter even worse than usual. Martha took it all in stride, helping her pick out a riding outfit that was practical but flattering, and offering advice about everything from conversation topics to how to sit properly on a horse. "Just be yourself, dear," Martha said the night before the ride. "That's all any good man wants." But what if I can't even talk to him properly?" The words came out in frustrated bursts. "What if he thinks I'm stupid?" Martha cupped Willa's face in both hands, her expression fierce. "Anyone who thinks you're stupid because of how you talk isn't worth a moment of your time. You're one of the smartest women I know, Willa Everett. Don't you forget that." Saturday dawned clear and bright, with a breeze that took some of the edge off the August heat. Nathan arrived exactly when he'd promised, leading 2 horses behind his own mount. One was a gentle-looking mare with kind eyes, and Willa felt some of her nervousness ease when Nathan introduced her as Buttercup. "She's the calmest horse on the Sullivan Ranch," he said, helping Willa into the saddle. You could set off dynamite next to her and she'd probably just keep chewing grass. The ride north took them through country that stole Willa's breath, even as it terrified her. The land rolled and dipped, painted in shades of gold and brown and green where the river carved its path through the earth. Nathan pointed out landmarks as they rode, his voice low and steady, and Willa found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse beneath her and the comfort of his presence beside her. The canyon revealed itself gradually, the earth simply opening up into a slash of red stone and shadow that plunged down toward a silver thread of water far below. Nathan dismounted and helped Willa down, and they stood at the edge while the wind pulled at their clothes and hair. "It's beautiful," Willa breathed and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Figured you might like it." Nathan stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Not much like Boston, I imagine. And no, nothing like it." She turned to look at him and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Thank you for bringing me here." "Willa," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name without the formal miss before it. "I need to tell you something, and I want you to know you can tell me to mind my own business if you want." Her heart started that nervous hammering again. What? "I like talking with you. I like how you think about things, how you notice details other people miss. And I like the way you don't try to fill every silence with chatter just for the sake of noise." He paused, his storm cloud eyes searching hers. "Your stutter doesn't bother me. Not even a little bit. So if you're ever worried about that when we're talking, I want you to know you don't need to be." Willa felt tears prick at her eyes, hot and unexpected. People usually get impatient," she said quietly. "Or they try to finish my sentences, or they just stop talking to me altogether. Then those people are fools." Nathan's voice was firm. "And I'm not a patient man by nature, Willa. Ask anyone who knows me. But waiting for you to say what you want to say, that's not patience. That's just giving you the same respect I'd give anyone else." She didn't mean to cry, but a few tears escaped anyway, tracking down her cheeks in the dry air. Nathan pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her with the same gentle courtesy he'd shown her from the beginning. "I'm sorry," she said, dabbing at her eyes. I'm not usually this emotional. Nothing to apologize for." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Can I tell you something else?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'd like to court you properly if you're amenable. Take you to dinner, maybe to the dance they hold in town once a month. Let people know that I'm interested in being more than just your friend." He smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "But only if that's what you want too." Willa looked out at the canyon, at the vast, beautiful emptiness of the Colorado landscape, and felt something shift inside her chest. For so much of her life, she'd made herself small, tried to hide her stutter and her nervousness and anything else that might draw unwanted attention. But standing here with Nathan, with this man who waited for her words like they were worth their weight in gold, she felt like maybe she could be something more than small. I'd like that," she said, and when she looked back at him, his smile was bright enough to rival the sun. They rode back to town slowly, talking about everything and nothing. Nathan told her about his childhood in Missouri, about a family farm that grew tobacco and corn, and his mother who'd made the best apple pie he'd ever tasted. Willa told him about Boston, about her mother's quiet strength during her final illness, about the strange mix of grief and relief she'd felt when she'd finally boarded the train west. "You miss it?" Nathan asked as Fort Lyon came into view on the horizon. "The city, I mean." Willa considered the question carefully. "I miss some things. The libraries, the symphony. But I don't miss feeling like everyone was always watching, always judging." She glanced at him. Here I feel like I can breathe. Good, Nathan said simply. Because I'm hoping you'll stay for a long while. School started the following Monday, and Willa threw herself into teaching with a determination that surprised even Martha. She had 19 students ranging from 6-year-old Emma Patterson, who showed up the first day with a frog in her pocket, to 15-year-old James Morrison, the sheriff's son, who clearly thought he was too old for school but attended anyway because his father insisted. Billy Sullivan was exactly as advertised. 7 years old and absolutely determined to test every boundary Willa set. He put a snake in her desk drawer the second day, tied Emma's braids to her chair on the third day, and on the fourth day, announced loudly that lady teachers were stupid and couldn't teach nothing worth knowing. Willa waited for him to finish his pronouncement, her hands folded calmly on her desk, while the other students watched with wide eyes to see what she'd do. When Billy finally ran out of steam, she simply said, "Are you finished, Mr. Sullivan?" The formal address seemed to surprise him. He nodded warily. "Good. Then I'd like you to tell the class 3 reasons why you think teachers are stupid. Use complete sentences and in proper grammar." Billy's mouth fell open. He clearly hadn't expected to have to defend his position. The other students waited in breathless silence. Billy stammered, and Willa saw the exact moment when he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. "Take your time," she said kindly. I'll wait." He couldn't do it, of course. After a few minutes of painful silence, he muttered an apology and slouched back to his desk. Willa counted it as a victory, even though she knew the battle with Billy Sullivan was far from over. Nathan stopped by the schoolhouse after classes ended that Friday, leaning against the doorframe while Willa cleaned the chalkboard and straightened desks. "Heard you handled Billy Sullivan without even raising your voice," he said, and she could hear the approval in his tone. "His mama says he came home and told her you were the scariest teacher he'd ever had." Willa laughed, a sound that came more easily now than it had a few weeks ago. "I just made him think. That's more terrifying than any punishment." "You're something special, Willa Everett." Nathan crossed the room to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell sage and leather and something that was uniquely him. "I'm having dinner at the hotel tomorrow night. Would you join me?" She agreed without hesitation, and the next evening found her in her best dress, a deep blue silk that Martha had altered to fit perfectly. The hotel dining room was the fanciest establishment in Fort Lyon, which meant it had actual tablecloths and more than 3 items on the menu. Nathan stood when she entered, his eyes widening appreciatively at the sight of her. "You look beautiful," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. Over dinner, they talked about her first week of teaching, about the characters among her students, about Nathan's work at the Sullivan Ranch. He told her about breaking a wild Mustang that week, about the satisfaction of taking something untamed and earning its trust rather than breaking its spirit. "Some men think you have to dominate a horse completely," he said, cutting into his steak. "Beat it into submission. But I've never seen that work long term. You have to show the horse that you're worth trusting, that you won't hurt it even when it's scared and fighting you." "That's how I feel about teaching," Willa said, surprising herself with the observation. "Especially with students like Billy. They test you because they want to know if you're safe." Nathan reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You are safe," he said quietly, "and those kids are lucky to have you." Autumn came to Colorado in a riot of gold and orange, the cottonwood trees along the river transforming into pillars of flame against the blue sky. Willa fell into a rhythm with her teaching, and the students slowly warmed to her methods. Even Billy Sullivan eventually became one of her most enthusiastic pupils once she figured out that he learned best when he was allowed to move. So she started giving him special jobs that let him get up and walk around the classroom. Nathan courted her with a steadiness that felt like bedrock beneath her feet. He took her to dinner once a week, came to the schoolhouse most afternoons to walk her home, and showed up at Martha's house on Sundays with wildflowers he'd picked on his morning rides. They went on picnics by the river, rode out to see the aspens turning gold in the mountains, and spent long evenings on Martha's porch talking about everything from philosophy to whether cats made better pets than dogs. Willa's stutter didn't disappear, but she found it mattered less and less. Nathan never showed impatience, never tried to rush her, and his example seemed to set the tone for how others in town treated her. The students learned to wait without fidgeting when she struggled with a word, and even crusty Mr. Henderson at the trading post stopped trying to finish her sentences. But it was what Nathan said one evening in late October that cemented itself in her heart forever. They were sitting by the river, watching the water catch the last rays of sunset, when Willa tried to tell him about something that had happened in class that day. Her nerves were high because it involved Billy Sullivan doing something particularly thoughtful, and she wanted to share it, but the words tangled on her tongue. "I stutter when I'm nervous," she finally said in frustration, the words themselves stuttering even as she explained her condition. "I've always been this way." Nathan turned to look at her, his expression serious but his eyes warm. "Then I'll wait for every word forever," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Willa, you could take an hour to finish a sentence and I'd sit right here and wait for it, because what you have to say is worth hearing." She kissed him then, the first kiss they'd shared, and it tasted like promises and patience and the kind of love that doesn't demand perfection, but instead offers grace. Winter arrived with snow that turned Fort Lyon into something from a fairy tale. The schoolhouse was harder to heat, and Willa often taught with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders while the students huddled close to the pot-bellied stove. But there was something magical about those short winter days, the way the snow muffled sound and made the world feel smaller and more intimate. Nathan proposed on Christmas Eve, in Martha's parlor with her aunt as a beaming witness. He'd carved a wooden box himself, lined with velvet, and inside was a ring with a small diamond that caught the firelight like a captured star. "I know I don't have much to offer yet," he said, down on one knee while Willa's hands flew to her mouth. "Just a ranch hand's wages and a room at the boarding house. But I've been saving, and Mr. Sullivan says if I want to buy that piece of land adjacent to his property, he'll help me get started with my own herd. I'm asking you to take a chance on us, and build something together." "Why, yes," Willa said through happy tears. "Yes, yes, yes." They were married in March of 1877, just as the prairie started showing the first hints of spring green. Reverend Michaels performed the ceremony in the little church, with what seemed like the entire town crammed into the pews. Martha cried happy tears. Billy Sullivan sat on the edge of his seat looking proud to see his teacher getting married. And when Nathan kissed Willa at the altar, the congregation erupted in applause. They moved into a small house on the land Nathan had bought, and spent the first months of their marriage working from dawn to dusk to build something lasting. Nathan worked with the cattle, building his herd slowly and carefully, while Willa continued teaching and helped with the ranch work in the evenings and on weekends. It was hard work, harder than anything Willa had done in her privileged Boston upbringing. Her hands developed calluses, her skin tanned despite her best efforts with bonnets and long sleeves, and she learned the 1,000 small skills that went into running a frontier homestead. But she'd never been happier. Nathan was everything she'd never dared to hope for in a husband. He was patient and kind, yes, but he was also passionate and determined and occasionally stubborn in ways that led to spirited discussions over the dinner table. He supported her teaching even when other ranchers suggested maybe their wives should stay home, and he never once made her feel like her stutter was anything to be ashamed of. They developed a language all their own, part words and part gestures, and part that unspoken communication that comes when two people know each other deeply. On days when Willa's stutter was particularly bad, Nathan would simply take her hand and wait, his thumb making slow circles on her palm until the words came. And she learned to read his silences, to know when he was worried about the cattle, or excited about a new foal, or just tired from a long day's work. Their first child arrived in the spring of 1878, a son they named Thomas Michael Worthing. He had Nathan's storm-cloud eyes and Willa's determination, and from the moment the midwife placed him in Nathan's arms, Willa knew she was seeing something that would sustain her through any hardship. The sight of her husband cradling their baby with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Willa took a year away from teaching to care for Thomas, and discovered that motherhood suited her in ways she hadn't expected. She sang to him constantly, finding that her stutter disappeared almost completely when she sang, and Thomas grew into a happy baby who smiled at everything and everyone. But she missed teaching too, missed the challenge and the reward of watching young minds expand and grow. So when Thomas turned 1, she worked out an arrangement with Martha and a few other women in town to share childcare duties, and returned to her schoolhouse with a renewed sense of purpose. The next few years passed in a blur of hard work and simple joys. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, Nathan's reputation as a fair dealer, and a skilled cattleman spreading throughout Colorado. Willa's school became known as one of the best in the region, and families sometimes moved to Fort Lyon specifically so their children could study with her. Billy Sullivan grew up and went east to college, but not before telling Willa that she was the reason he'd learned to love learning. Emma Patterson became Willa's teaching assistant when she turned 16, helping with the younger students and showing a natural gift for education. In 1880, they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose. She had Willa's auburn hair and Nathan's quiet strength, and Thomas took to his role as big brother with serious dedication. Willa would often find them in the mornings, Thomas reading to Clara from his primer even though she was far too young to understand the words. The ranch prospered. Nathan bought more land, built a bigger house with a room specifically for Willa's books and teaching materials, and took on 2 ranch hands to help with the growing herd. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, cattle disease and the occasional dispute with neighboring ranchers, but through it all they had each other. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Nathan took Willa back to the canyon where he'd first told her that her words were worth waiting for. They stood at the edge while the sunset painted the rocks in shades of red and gold, and Nathan pulled her close. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving Boston, coming out here, marrying a cowboy?" Willa looked out at the vast Colorado landscape, at the endless sky, and the wild, beautiful country that had become her home. She thought about her students, about Thomas and Clara sleeping safely at Martha's house for the night, about the life she and Nathan had built together through hard work and determination and love. "And never," she said, and the word came out clean and clear. "Not for a single moment." "Even when I track mud across your clean floors," Nathan teased, pulling her closer. "Even then," she smiled up at him. "You've given me everything, Nathan. A home, a family, a place where I can be myself without apology." You gave me all that too, Willa. Before you, I was just going through the motions. Working, sleeping, existing but not really living. He cupped her face in his hands, those calloused rancher's hands that could be so gentle. You taught me that the best things are worth waiting for. They kissed as the sun set behind the canyon, and Willa thought about how far she'd come from that nervous girl on the stagecoach, how much she'd grown and changed and blossomed in the Colorado sun. The years continued their steady march. Thomas grew tall and serious, showing an aptitude for ranching that made Nathan's chest swell with pride. Clara developed her mother's love of books and her father's way with animals, and could often be found in the barn reading to the horses. In 1883, they had a third child, another son they named James Patrick, who came into the world with a lusty cry and a shock of black hair. Willa eventually had to give up teaching when managing 3 children and helping run an increasingly successful ranch became too much for one person to handle. She mourned the loss of her classroom, but found new ways to satisfy her love of education. She tutored students in the evenings, helped establish a lending library in Fort Lyon, and made sure her own children grew up surrounded by books and learning. Nathan became one of the most respected ranchers in southeastern Colorado, known for his fair dealing and his innovative approaches to cattle breeding. But no matter how successful the ranch became, no matter how busy they were, he never forgot to wait for Willa's words, never showed impatience when her stutter tangled her tongue, and there were hard times too. They lost a portion of their herd to disease in 1885, and the financial strain nearly broke them. But they weathered it together, Nathan taking extra work as a deputy again, while Willa took in sewing and sold eggs in town. Thomas, only 7 years old, insisted on doing extra chores to help, and even little Clara found ways to contribute. They came through it stronger, the adversity forging them into something even more resilient. And when the ranch recovered, when the herd rebuilt and the finances stabilized, they remembered what it felt like to have nothing but each other and their determination, and it made their success all the sweeter. In 1888, Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep, and Willa grieved for the aunt who'd given her a chance at a new life. They buried her in the Fort Lyon cemetery under a cottonwood tree, and Willa made sure fresh flowers graced her grave every week. But life continued, as it always does. Thomas grew into a young man who was courting the banker's daughter. Clara announced her intention to become a teacher like her mother, and James proved to be a handful who reminded Willa forcefully of Billy Sullivan at that age. On a summer evening in 1890, Willa and Nathan sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas was out checking the cattle. Clara was inside helping James with his letters, and for a moment, everything was quiet and perfect. "Do you remember the first day we met?" Willa asked, leaning into Nathan's side. Her stutter had lessened over the years but never completely disappeared, though by now it was just a part of how she spoke, no longer something that caused her shame. "Of course. You fell into that drunk miner's lap when the stage stopped and came out looking like you wanted to fight the whole territory." Nathan's arm came around her shoulders. "I thought you were the bravest thing I'd ever seen." "I was terrified." Willa laughed at the memory. "Everything was so different from what I'd known. But then you offered to help me, and something just felt right." "I knew that first day," Nathan said quietly. "When you stumbled over your words and looked at me like you expected me to mock you, I knew I wanted to be the person who proved you could trust someone with all of yourself, stutter and all. You've done more than that." Willa turned to look at him, this man who'd kept every promise he'd ever made to her. You've given me a life beyond anything I'd dreamed." Nathan kissed her forehead, a gesture so familiar and comforting that Willa felt tears prick her eyes. "We gave it to each other," he corrected gently. "Every good thing we have, we built together." Clara called from inside that dinner was ready, and they rose to go inside, Nathan's hand firmly in Willa's. Through the window, Willa could see the table set for 5, her children moving around the kitchen with the easy comfort of people who knew they were loved and secure. This was her life now. Not the Boston brownstone, or the careful propriety of Miss Halloway's school for young ladies, but this wild, beautiful Colorado ranch with its endless sky and its hard work and its deep satisfactions. A life built on patience and trust, and the kind of love that didn't demand perfection, but instead offered grace at every turn. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Thomas married his banker's daughter in 1892, and Willa gained a daughter-in-law who was smart and capable and fit seamlessly into their family. Clara did indeed become a teacher, taking over Willa's old schoolhouse when the previous teacher retired, and James eventually settled into his studies enough to show a real gift for mathematics. Nathan's hair started to silver at the temples, and Willa found lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, but they wore their age with pride. Each wrinkle represented a year lived fully, each silver hair a testament to time spent building something lasting. In 1895, Thomas and his wife presented them with their first grandchild, a daughter they named Willa Martha in honor of the 2 women who'd shaped Thomas's life. Willa cried when they told her the name, thinking about her mother and her aunt, and the long chain of women who'd loved and sacrificed and built lives in whatever circumstances they found themselves. Watching Nathan hold his granddaughter, seeing the same tenderness he'd shown their own children, Willa felt her heart might burst with gratitude for this life she'd stumbled into 20 years ago. The ranch continued to prosper. They added more land, built better facilities, and Nathan's cattle became sought after throughout the region. But success never changed the fundamental nature of their relationship. Nathan still waited patiently for Willa's words, still pulled her close on difficult days, and reminded her that they were partners in everything. They weathered the economic panic of 1893 better than most, their careful management and lack of debt keeping them stable when other ranchers went under. Nathan made sure to help where he could, extending credit to neighbors who needed it and organizing community efforts to support struggling families. "We've been blessed," he told Willa one night when she questioned whether they could afford to be so generous. And blessings are meant to be shared, not hoarded. It was one of the 1,000 reasons she loved him, this man who'd grown from a Missouri farm boy into a pillar of their community, while never losing his fundamental decency and kindness. Clara married in 1897, a young lawyer from Denver who'd come to Fort Lyon on business and stayed for love. The wedding was even bigger than Thomas's, with guests coming from as far as Colorado Springs to celebrate. Willa watched her daughter take her vows and remembered her own wedding day, remembered the feel of Nathan's hand in hers and the promise of a future built together. James proved to be the child in no hurry to leave home. He worked the ranch alongside Nathan, showing a gift for business management that complemented Nathan's practical ranching skills perfectly. Together, father and son expanded the operation in ways neither could have done alone, and Willa watched with pride as James grew into a man who carried the best qualities of both his parents. In 1899, as the century drew to a close, Willa and Nathan took a trip back east to Boston. It was Willa's first return since she'd left nearly 25 years earlier, and she was shocked by how foreign it all felt. The crowded streets, the noise, the way everyone seemed to be in a constant hurry. It all felt wrong somehow, claustrophobic in ways she'd never noticed when she'd lived there. They stayed a week, visiting her mother's grave and the old brownstone where she'd grown up, now occupied by a family of strangers. But Willa found she felt nothing but a distant nostalgia for the life she'd left behind. Her home was in Colorado now, had been for more than half her life, and she couldn't wait to get back to it. On the train heading west, Nathan asked if she was sad to leave Boston again. "No," Willa said, and there was no stutter in the word. "I was just confirming what I'd already known. Home isn't where you're from. It's where you choose to build your life." Nathan squeezed her hand. "And you chose Colorado." "I chose you," Willa corrected. Everything else just followed from that. They returned to the ranch to find everything running smoothly under James's management, and slipped back into their routines with the comfort of people who knew exactly where they belonged. The new century arrived with celebrations and hope, and Willa stood on her porch on New Year's Day 1900, looking out at the land she and Nathan had built their life on. Thomas had 3 children now. Clara was expecting her first, and James was courting a rancher's daughter from the next county over. The schoolhouse Clara taught in was the same one Willa had once taught in, though it had been expanded and improved over the years. The ranch that Nathan had started with a small herd and a dream now covered thousands of acres and employed a dozen men. The town of Fort Lyon had grown too, with new businesses and new families arriving every year. But through all the changes, one thing had remained constant: Nathan's patience, his unwavering support, his determination to wait for every word Willa spoke as if it were precious. They grew old together, their hair turning silver, their hands becoming gnarled with age and hard work, their faces mapping out the years with lines and wrinkles. But Nathan still looked at Willa like she was the bravest, most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, and Willa still felt her heart skip when Nathan took her hand. In 1905, they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together 3 generations of their family and half the county besides. Their children and grandchildren filled the ranch house with noise and laughter, and Willa stood in the middle of it all, marveling at how much had grown from that first terrified decision to get on a stagecoach and travel west. Billy Sullivan came to the anniversary party, now a successful lawyer in Denver with a family of his own. He sought Willa out specifically to thank her for believing in him when he'd been a wild 7-year-old, determined to test every boundary. "You changed my life, Mrs. Worthing," he said, shaking her hand with both of his. "You showed me that being smart wasn't something to be ashamed of, that learning could be exciting. Everything I am today started in your classroom." After the party, when all the guests had gone home and the grandchildren were asleep in various bedrooms throughout the house, Willa and Nathan sat on their porch in the rocking chairs they'd bought years ago. 30 years, Willa said softly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together." "Best 30 years of my life," Nathan said, reaching over to take her hand. "And I'm looking forward to the next 30, Willa laughed. "We'll be in our 80s, Nathan." "So, I plan to wait for your words when I'm 80 just like I waited for them when I was 26. He brought her hand to his lips. "That's what I promised, Willa, forever." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Colorado sky, and Willa thought about the girl she'd been, so nervous and uncertain, convinced her stutter made her less than. She thought about the woman she'd become, a teacher who'd shaped young minds, a mother who'd raised 3 good children, a partner who'd helped build something lasting. And she thought about Nathan, this man who'd seen past her stutter to the person beneath, who'd offered patience when the world had offered judgment, who'd kept every promise he'd ever made to her. The years that followed were gentler, the pace slower. They handed over more of the ranch operations to James, who married his rancher's daughter and brought her to live at the ranch. Nathan and Willa moved into a smaller house on the property, one that was easier to maintain and closer to town. Willa's stutter grew worse with age, as did the arthritis in her hands that made writing difficult. But Nathan never showed impatience, never finished her sentences, just waited with the same steady kindness he'd shown her from the beginning. They were blessed with more grandchildren, and then great-grandchildren, and Willa's days were filled with the joy of watching her family grow and flourish. She told stories to the little ones about coming west on the stagecoach, about their grandfather waiting patiently for her words, about building a life in the wild Colorado frontier. In 1910, they celebrated their 35th anniversary quietly, just the two of them and their children and grandchildren. Willa was 74 years old now, Nathan was 76, and they moved slower than they once had, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work. But when Nathan took her in his arms to dance to the fiddle music Thomas played, Willa felt like she was 22 again, accepting a ride from a kind stranger who would become everything to her. "I love you," she said, the words stuttering but sincere. "More than words can say." "I know," Nathan said, pulling her closer. "You've shown me every day for 35 years, and I love you too, Willa Everett Worthing, with everything I am." They continued dancing as the sun set over the Colorado prairie. Two people who'd built a life together through patience and determination and love, surrounded by the evidence of that life in the form of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would carry their legacy forward. And in the quiet moments between the music and the laughter, Willa offered up a prayer of gratitude for the stutter that had once made her feel less than, because without it, she might never have discovered the profound gift of being loved by someone who would wait for every word forever. The seasons turned as they always did. Spring brought new calves and fresh grass. Summer brought heat and long days of work. Autumn painted the cottonwoods gold, and winter covered everything in snow. Through it all, Willa and Nathan faced each day together, their love deepening with time rather than fading. They were fortunate in their health, both remaining relatively strong well into their 70s. Nathan still insisted on helping with the ranch work when James would let him, and Willa still tutored students who needed extra help, though now she did it from her comfortable living room rather than in the schoolhouse. In 1912, Clara had her 6th child, another daughter, and Willa marveled at how her family had grown. From just the two of them standing at an altar 35 years ago, they'd created this sprawling network of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them connected by the bonds of love and shared history. Thomas took over as patriarch of the family when Nathan finally agreed to fully retire, and proved himself more than capable of managing both the ranch and the various business interests they developed over the years. But everyone knew that the heart of the family was still Willa and Nathan, the two people whose love story had started it all. On quiet evenings when the house was peaceful and the grandchildren had gone home, Willa and Nathan would sit together and remember. They'd talk about that first day at the trading post, about the ride north to Martha's house, about the canyon where Nathan had first told her he wanted to court her. You ever wonder what would have happened if I'd said no?" Willa asked one night, her stutter more pronounced with age but no longer something that caused her anxiety. I'd have asked again, Nathan said without hesitation, and kept asking until you said yes or told me plainly to leave you alone. Because I knew from that first day, Willa. I knew you were worth waiting for. How could you have known that? You'd barely spoken to me. Nathan thought about it for a moment, his weathered face peaceful in the lamplight. It was the way you held yourself, scared but determined, fragile but strong. And when you stuttered, there was this flash in your eyes, like you were daring me to mock you or dismiss you. I wanted to be the person who proved not everyone would. Willa leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, sage and leather and home. You did more than prove it. You showed me what real love looks like. They sat in companionable silence until the lamp burned low. Two people who'd spent decades learning to speak the language of each other's hearts, who'd built something lasting through patience and determination and grace. In the spring of 1914, Nathan's health began to fail. It started small, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, a tiredness that rest didn't cure. The doctor confirmed what they'd both feared. His heart was giving out, worn down by decades of hard labor and a long life well lived. Nathan faced the diagnosis with the same steady courage he'd faced everything else. But Willa felt the world tilting beneath her feet. They'd been together for 37 years, and she couldn't imagine a day without him, couldn't conceive of going on without his patient presence beside her. I'm not leaving you, Nathan said when he saw the fear in her eyes. Not really. Everything we built together, everything we created, that's all still here. I'm in every board of this house, every fence post on this ranch, every one of our children and grandchildren. You won't be without me, Willa. But knowing that didn't make the prospect of losing him any easier to bear. They spent that summer making the most of every day. Nathan insisted on going on a final ride to the canyon, and though it exhausted him, he said it was worth it to stand at that edge one more time with Willa beside him. They sat on the porch every evening, Nathan in his rocking chair with Willa close beside him, talking about their life together and all the memories they'd created. The family gathered frequently, understanding without being told that their time with Nathan was limited. He made sure to speak privately with each of his children, to hold each grandchild, to impart whatever wisdom he felt they needed to carry forward. But it was Willa he wanted beside him most, Willa whose hand he held as his strength slowly faded, Willa whose face he wanted to see first thing every morning and last thing every night. In late August, Nathan took a turn for the worse. The doctor confirmed there was nothing more to be done, that it was just a matter of time. The family gathered at the ranch house, filling the rooms with their presence and their love, but they all understood that the vigil at Nathan's bedside belonged primarily to Willa. She sat beside him for hours, holding his hand and remembering. She told him about the first time she'd seen him in the trading post, how his storm cloud eyes had made her breath catch. She reminded him of their wedding day, of the births of their children, of the 1,000 small moments that had made up their life together. I've loved you since that first day, she said, tears streaming down her face. Every day with you has been a gift. Nathan's hand tightened on hers, his breathing labored but his eyes clear. Then I'll wait for every word forever, he whispered, echoing the promise he'd made her so many years ago. Even death won't change that, Willa. I'll be waiting for you, wherever I end up, and I'll listen to every word you want to say without ever growing impatient. He died that evening as the sun set over the Colorado prairie, surrounded by his family but with Willa's hand in his final breath a gentle exhale that carried him from this world to whatever came next. The grief threatened to drown Willa. For weeks, She could barely function, the loss of Nathan's steady presence leaving a hole in her life that nothing could fill. But gradually, with the support of her children and the demands of her grandchildren, she found her way back to living. She lived for another 8 years, long enough to see more great-grandchildren born, long enough to watch James's children begin to take on leadership roles at the ranch, long enough to know with certainty that everything she and Nathan had built would continue long after she was gone. She never remarried. The very idea seemed absurd. Nathan had been her partner, her love, the person who'd waited for her words and shown her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. There could never be anyone else. Instead, she poured her energy into her family and her community. She made sure every child knew the story of how their grandparents or great-grandparents had met, how Nathan had offered patience when the world offered judgment, how love built on mutual respect and grace could weather any storm. She continued tutoring until her health made it impossible, continued spending time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, continued living the legacy that she and Nathan had created together. On a warm evening in June 1922, Willa sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Clara was inside preparing dinner, and the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open windows. Willa was 86 years old, her body worn but her mind still sharp, and she thought about the life she'd lived. She thought about that terrified girl on the stagecoach, convinced her stutter made her less than. She thought about Nathan offering her a ride, offering her patience, offering her a future built on grace and love. She thought about their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, all the lives that had sprung from that first meeting in a frontier trading post. And she thought about Nathan waiting for her, wherever he was, ready to listen to every word she wanted to say with the same patient kindness he'd shown her from the beginning. That night, Willa passed away peacefully in her sleep, her hand clutching the handkerchief Nathan had given her that day at the canyon 46 years earlier. They buried her beside him in the Fort Lyon cemetery under the cottonwood trees, and on her headstone, Thomas made sure to include the words his father had said so many years ago. "Then I'll wait for every word forever." The ranch continued under James's capable management, and then under his children, and then under their children. The schoolhouse where Willa had taught eventually became a museum, preserved as a testament to the woman who'd shaped so many young minds despite her stutter. Or perhaps because of it, because she'd understood what it meant to struggle and overcome. And in Fort Lyon, Colorado, the story of Nathan and Willa became the stuff of legend. Young couples would visit their graves and leave flowers, hoping some of that patient, enduring love would bless their own relationships. Parents would tell their children about the cowboy who waited, and the teacher who found her voice, using it as a lesson about kindness and acceptance, and the transformative power of grace. Because in the end, their story wasn't really about a stutter or even about the Wild West frontier. It was about two people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment, who'd built a life together through patience and determination and love, who'd proved that the best things in life are always worth waiting for. And somewhere beyond the veil of this world and whatever comes after, Nathan waited with infinite patience for Willa to tell him all about the sunset she'd seen that last evening, ready to listen to every word with the same devotion he'd shown her for nearly 4 decades of their life together. Their legacy lived on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their values forward, in the ranch that still bore the Worthing name, in the countless students whose lives Willa had touched, in the memory of a love that had transcended every obstacle and every challenge to become something eternal. The Wild West may have been tamed, the frontier may have been settled, But the story of Nathan and Willa remained a testament to what was possible when two people chose patience over judgment, grace over criticism, and love over everything else. Their words had created a legacy that would endure for generations, a reminder that sometimes the most profound promises are the simplest ones, and that waiting for someone with love and patience is its own form of poetry, more beautiful than any words could ever express.